Do you find yourself breaking out into hives at the idea of setting a boundary? Do you feel like you're being unkind or mean and it feels like you're not quite sure how to set a boundary? This week, we're going to talk about how to set boundaries with kindness, connection, and without feeling like you're being mean.
Hey, welcome back to the Pursuit of Happy Well podcast. We're excited to jump into another great topic that goes hand in hand with last week's episode.
Yeah, so if you listened to last week's episode, we talked about conflict resolution and the 3 words that can de-escalate conflict before it even happens.
And turn it into?
Connection.
Connection, yes.
Yes. And obviously what we are about here, the Pursuit of Happy Well, we talk about one of our pillars is about being in healthy relationships and connection with others, being in community. It's one of the tenets to leading, a well-lived life, a happy, well life. And so what comes with that, what comes with having healthy connection is the ability to set boundaries, healthy boundaries.
Healthy boundaries. Yes, healthy boundaries. So if it's your first time listening to us, we'd love for you to leave a review afterwards. Hit subscribe button, the bell notification on YouTube if you're watching. And I would love for just you to have some commenting. Wow, I was gonna say have some conflict. I don't want you to have conflict.
You know what? Conflicts do happen in the comment section, babe.
Conflicts do happen. Dude, isn't that the truth? We'd love for you just to leave a comment down below as you're working through this video. Thoughts that come up, things that, questions that might come up, anything that sparks your interest as you are watching. But today, we're really excited about this idea of boundaries. Many of us have a hard time setting boundaries, but today, hopefully, we can reframe, redefine boundaries, not as a means of cutting everything out, but as a way of of explaining your values, of self-respect, and reframing it in a way that allows to take some of that drama and some of that heat and maybe some anxiety about producing boundaries and putting them in place. Hopefully, we can remove some of that today.
Yeah, I would love people to feel empowered around boundaries. I feel like I'm just now, like as we're turning 40 this year, which is wild to think. I feel like it's taken me a long time to wrap my mind around the function of a boundary, why a boundary, why it's not unkind. I think I've just had a lot of stories around boundaries my whole life, you know?
Yeah. So before we jump into the first segment about why we have so much drama and why it's so hard and why we struggle so much with setting boundaries, let's define a little bit of what a boundary is and what we're talking about. And the idea that a boundary is not necessarily like a barrier, but it's a line in which we define where we end and someone else begins. And I think that alone, maybe that alone is all you need to hear. I think sometimes we think about boundaries as a fence, right? As a barrier, as this big bridge, a chasm that we put in place and no one wants to. Sometimes we view it that way. And that's what gives us a lot of our anxiety and struggle with it is because we think we're being mean.
Yeah, I'm cutting this person
out.
Yeah.
When really what we're talking about today, redefine what a boundary is really a place in which I understand where you begin, where I am at, where that line is, and how healthy communication, healthy relationship can happen.
I like to think of a boundary instead of like a wall. I think of a good mental visual for me is a gate. Like there's still, a level of separation, but there is the function of a gate that I can open at my choosing. If I want to let the person in, come closer. I think it's a healthy access point versus just, it's wide open all the time. Like boundaries are essential to our mental health and our emotional well-being.
Yeah, I heard it once as a gate, in the sense that it is a gate. This is the way in which you are able to be in relationship with me. Here's the key. I'm going to define with clarity and compassion. Here's the key to getting through that gate. Otherwise, if you decide to circumvent, you're going to be climbing over, the fence or whatever it might be, which would be a breach of my boundaries and a breach of where I am and where you begin and so forth. And so let's dive into this idea of like why, and maybe you already have some thoughts on why you struggle with setting boundaries, but let's dive into a little bit what creates the struggle with boundaries. And I think some of this, if you haven't listened to our last episode on conflict, I think it would be very interesting to listen to both of these back to back, or vice versa, flip them around, whatever. Listen to them through the lens of each other,
Yeah.
Because I think they will speak hand in hand very clearly to what's happening to us when we try and create boundaries and the struggle with boundaries.
Yeah. So I think people have a lot of different emotions or thoughts around boundaries. And it might be because, again, how they've seen other people label boundaries, which might not have been a boundary. It might have been a punishment or resentment or revenge.
That's a podcast in itself.
Yeah. It's just like, emotional payback or control or coercion or something like that. So some people might have a warped view of what a boundary is. And so, but I also think the emotional reasons would be like, what happens, especially if I've been somebody that has been without boundaries and people have had, constant access to me whenever they want. What happens when I limit the access to protect my mental health? I think the fear is, will I still be loved? Will I still matter? Is this person, who am I going to upset when I am no longer available and accessible 24/7? I think that is a very real emotion people likely will sit with, is like, whose love might I lose if I put a boundary in place?
Yeah. Yeah. That's one of the struggles, right? Is a fear of conflict, which is what we talked about last week. And sometimes that conflict is with another person, that fear of conflicts with another person. Sometimes that's a conflict within, in the sense of, will I still be loved?
Mm-hmm.
Is my my value, because I put a boundary in, does my value go away all of a sudden? And now that person is no longer going to be in relationship with me anymore. And so
I have very protective thoughts for that person.
I agree. Yeah, that's why I paused.
My fight response is like kicking in, and I want to be like, "You matter. The person's abusing you. This is a power dynamic that they're abusing."
Yeah. So one of the struggles is tied to people pleasing, not just in the value side, but just kind of that fawning response. Like, I'm not going to put a boundary, or I struggle with boundaries because I'm just people pleasing all the time. And I have a fear of either being rejected, or I have a fear of conflict, or I have a fear of, are they going to love me anymore, right? Some of those stress responses that pop up when I put a boundary in place, these are the stories we tell ourselves. And, some of us may have people in our lives where we've tried to set boundaries, and the stories that we've told ourselves, or what we just talked about, have been implemented or said, where they've used that boundary. So say, for instance, as an example, I try to set a boundary, and you see that boundary, not that you've done this, but you see that boundary and you use that as an opportunity to manipulate my boundary setting. And now you plant a story in my head that now makes boundaries for me an unsafe thing to create.
Yeah. Maybe I've like, because of my reaction to your boundary, I've told you that you're cruel, you're selfish, that you don't care about me. And depending on your own identity and your own worth and your thoughts about yourself, that will determine how readily you believe that story about yourself. So if you have, maybe low self-confidence and you hear me say that, you're going to be like, oh my gosh, maybe I am unkind. Maybe I am mean. And therefore you see boundaries as unkind and mean, and therefore you never set them. I think it's not just like the people pleasing. I think there is like, I think there's, will I still be loved? I think that's a very real one. I also think there is the reality of, I don't know who I am if I am not, I don't know who I will be as a boundaried person.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know who I am if I'm not constantly managing other people's feelings, emotions, their problems. Like, that's a full-time mental and emotional job for me. And so if I have a boundary, my job disappears, quote unquote, my job disappears, my role disappears, then, and if we over-identify with our role, then I disappear.
Yeah. There's more. We'll get to that towards the end of the podcast, as we talk about what it means to implement this and what it looks like. But that idea, essentially, of putting a boundary is this idea of what is loving versus limitless, right? Like, is it loving to be that involved where I don't know where I stop, where I'm so, the word is enmeshed, right? I'm so enmeshed in your well-being, well-being maybe is not the right word there, but like I'm so enmeshed with you as a person, I don't know where I stop. And so I have to struggle with like, is that a loving thing to do? Or if I put a boundary up, is that harsh? Is that unkind?
I think that is the internal conflict that people have. So,
Yeah.
but oftentimes I think there's the boundaries that are set from a stress response.
Oh yeah, the reactive ones.
It's a reactive boundary.
Which you said this at the start, which I thought was really
burn
good.
me once.
Yeah.
Shame on you.
Yeah.
Burn me twice. Shame. Or it's like I'm going to call it like revenge boundary.
Yeah.
Like you hurt me. Boom.
Yeah.
This is what's happening. It's not a loving boundary. It's like a boundary as a punishment.
Right.
And that is not
what we're
a
talking
boundary.
about. Yeah.
That is a maybe. I think once I coached someone on this, I said, "Oh, that's not a boundary. That is a response. That's a reaction to, or that's actually a consequence. There's a consequence to someone's mistreatment of you, and then so there's the consequence of it, and then there is the boundary that is more thought through that prevents further harm, so to speak."
Yeah, we'll talk about reframing the boundary. But a couple of things that good ideas or good things to rethink in the sense of the struggle with boundaries is one of these phrases from Henry Cloud, who wrote the book Boundaries. If you've ever read anything of Henry Cloud, he's got great books, great things to say. But this idea that boundaries define responsibility, not rejection. And and so that's a really interesting thing about like the idea of like a chasm. If we think of boundaries as this like separation, division, a chasm, if that's our view, what he's basically saying is no. The idea here is it's going to define what I'm responsible for, what you're responsible for, how we are going to responsibly be in relationship to one another, rather than thinking of it as I'm putting a boundary up because you're rejected.
Yeah.
I no longer want you.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
I think that's super powerful. And another one is Dr. Becky Kennedy. She talks about boundaries even with our children and how our children actually long for boundaries. I think that's fascinating. Like our children long for boundaries because it helps them understand like what is my function? How do I function in this space? And when there is no clear boundaries, it takes away their sense of safety and security. Like that is how a child establishes security is by finding boundaries. We see it as testing boundaries, but what they're doing is like I think of it like a dog with the invisible fence. Like they're skimming the perimeter to know like where's the fence.
That's hysterical.
But isn't that true?
It's so true. It just made me think of our old neighbor that had a dog that was so smart that it would sit just within tolerance.
Within tolerance.
Right? Like it would sit just on the edge of
the zap
zone or whatever, or the beep zone. I don't even know what all the zones are, but it would sit just on the edge to where it could drain the battery, but tolerate sitting there until the battery in the collar died. And then it would go and gallivant the neighborhood.
This is the perfect analogy. Don't you think our kids do this?
Yeah,
like,
and so
I'm going to sit on the yes. I'm going to sit on the just at the edge of tolerance, and I will wear you out and drain you until you relent on the boundary, and then I go.
That's so funny.
How is that not like? Come on.
No, I think that's
so true.
Well, it's true. I also think that's why we struggle with boundaries. Is because sometimes there's a couple things to say there. I think one reason we struggle with boundaries is because we have no tolerance for basically like holding to the boundary.
Ooh,
right? Like if you set a boundary and you never actually hold the like, can you imagine? I'm going into war.
What do you mean?
I'm thinking about like the Revolutionary War or like.
Oh, guys, by the way, P.S. Scott is a history major. Scott was a history major.
I love it. It's so good. But like, if you never hold the line, how could you ever hold a boundary? How could anyone ever trust that your boundary actually you mean it?
Well, and I do think that is what happens with some people, especially if the relationship has functioned for a long time without a boundary and you put in a boundary, there's going to be a couple responses. I think the person that gained power and benefited from your lack of boundary, their first thing is to test. They're going to see if the boundary is real. The moment you fold, they will never believe a boundary. They now know, awesome, your boundaries, they're just suggestions.
Yeah.
It's just in the suggestion box. I can bend this.
If we go back to the dogs analogy, we talk about my parents who have a dog that every time they eat,
oh my gosh,
whimpers, begs, barks until they get fed off the table.
Yep.
Because the boundary has not been kept.
Yeah.
Right.
And I joke. I'm like, I tell your dad, I'm like, that she has your number.
Yeah.
She's got you wrapped around her finger. But same thing. Like, I know if I just bark, yap, disturb your peace enough, you will relent on your boundary.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The war scene I was thinking of was out of The Patriot. Do you remember the last scene when they have the militia holding the line?
Yes.
And they deliberately use the British. I mean, this is a movie, right? So I don't know if this actually happened historically, but they deliberately use the militia's knowledge.
Yes.
Or, I'm sorry, the British knowledge of the militia's always retreating against them, right? Because they're on a knoll and they're trying to hold the line, but the militia run, which is what they always do. But the men were behind.
Yep.
On the other side,
it was a trap.
It was a trap. So, anyways, not saying to set a boundary as a trap. That totally went sideways.
It's okay. I love that movie, so it's all right. We can move forward.
Okay, so this is what we want to talk about. So that's one reason I think. I mean, there's probably more reasons. Maybe there's one that we haven't mentioned. That reason why you struggle with setting a boundary or keeping a boundary. You could drop that in the comments below on YouTube if you're watching. But the next part we want to talk about is this idea of like, can we reframe a boundary? Can we reframe it rather than sometimes what we think of it as being harsh, unkind, consequence, punishment boundary, reactive? Instead, reframing it to a boundary as compassionate clarity. And I love that idea of the fence and the key, or the gate and the key, because the idea is like, if I give you a boundary and I set it in a way with compassion, both because I value myself and I value you and I want to be in relationship with you. If I can reframe that to compassionate clarity, what I'm basically saying is, here's the key on how to stay in relationship with me at this time. And boundaries aren't always necessarily in a relationship that's strained or unhealthy. Sometimes it's in healthy relationships, again, knowing where I begin and where you begin. A boundary sets that up for a healthy relationship. But sometimes it can be in a relationship that is in conflict, or maybe safety has been broached.
Yeah.
And so giving that key is a compassionate way of saying, at this time, in this moment, I need to rebuild trust. And so I'm going to have compassionate clarity on what I know I'm able to do in this moment in our relationship, on how to stay in relationship with you.
I think the question is, where do I still function like in the best way? Where am I still functioning in a healthy way? And the moment I overfunction, that is where the boundary has to be put in. If I'm staying, like, for example, like, maybe this is be good for those that have the fawn response, that are like our people pleasers, the harmonizers, like, they're going to struggle to put in a boundary, but they have to realize, okay, where do I end and where does the other person begin as far as their autonomy and my autonomy? And so I have to put in a boundary so that I know I have now moved beyond my capacity, my resources, and my own emotional health, to where now I'm not healthy functioning. I'm over functioning to where it's depleting my mental well-being, my health, my sense of self. So where do I put that line so that I stay my healthy functioning self? So in this relationship, I am showing up healthy and whole, and we all benefit from me being this healthy functioning person because I have put a boundary in place.
Yeah, that's good.
Right.
I can also think through the fight and freeze. The flight and freeze.
Yeah.
I'll talk about in a minute. As I talk about that, I want you to think about, what does this look like for somebody who's more of the fight response, on how a boundary works in a fight response type of way. Hold on, don't answer. I want you to think through that.
Oh, okay.
I know. I want you to pause for a minute. But I think I can also think it's similar with the idea of the freeze. So a fawn is more of like a boundary, almost like a self-regulating boundary. But also, I can also think of the boundary for flight and freeze is a way of allowing themselves to allow that person in, right? Because I think in flight, if we don't have a boundary, we often get ourselves, and I know this is where I fall, I think most of the time, we get ourselves into communication, relationships, things that we feel unsafe or unease, or we don't want to be a part of. And so we do. We run away, we retreat.
Yeah.
Or freeze, we just freeze. And so one way we're saying this boundary is we're setting it to say, hey, we're not going to talk about, this, or we're not going to go there, or you're not going to treat me in this way because that's what I do in those moments. Right? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I guess maybe because it's not my default, but like, how would this work with fight?
Yeah. So fight is understanding at what point do I leave my healthy present self and I am activated into wanting to control, micromanage, fix. It's like, it's a different type of overfunction. Yeah. It's like where does a boundary need to be instilled so that I am not overstepping and potentially causing harm to those I am around, where I become snappy, short, aggressive, controlling, micromanaging, a fight response that's kind of interesting that we talk about in our quiz, because there's 10 different like specific subtypes of responses. We call them adaptive personality types. And there's 2 that are very similar, but they handle their conflict differently. The people pleaser is the one that's the fawn response, or we call it the emotional caretaker. It's like, I'm going to do whatever I can. Like, I will leave myself. I will overfunction to the point where I am consumed and absorbed by managing everyone's emotions and those things. And I have to emotionally manage everyone's feelings around me so that if they're emotionally okay, then I'm emotionally okay. A similar one that people have found, they're like, I thought I was a people pleaser or the emotional caregiver, but I found out I was a fight response fixer. The fixer is the person who, your problem is now my problem. I will step in. I can't watch you struggle. I'm going to actually insert myself into your problem, fix it for you. It looks like micromanaging, taking control. And so it's not quite enabling. Well, actually it is. And it's incredible. It's codependent and enmeshed, all those fun little labels we have. But it's that person, they have to realize what is mine to carry? Where does my responsibility begin and end? And where does their responsibility for their problems begin? Yeah. And so that particular fight response, they have to be, their boundary is knowing, what am I responsible for and what am I not responsible for? And they have to have that clear boundary. Whereas there's 2 other fight types, but essentially they have to know, where do I leave myself? At what point do I leave my healthiest, most whole, most present self? And when do I kind of self-harm and or potentially harm others? Yeah. That is where the boundary goes in.
I think what's interesting, we talk about this idea of compassionate clarity. I think sometimes we think about boundaries and we usually think of them as a them issue. And what I mean by that is we usually set boundaries because of something they did.
Yes.
They did that. It's their fault. They need the boundary. I need protection from them. And what I'm hearing as we continue to talk about this is compassionate clarity is a couple things. Yes, there might be something that someone did, true.
Yes.
But also compassionate clarity is getting clear on the issue from both perspectives.
Yep.
And owning what you need to own just as much as they need to own what they need to own. And I say that in a sense of, because what you're talking about with the fixer, setting a boundary may never happen from the person that you might be over involved with. That boundary may never come from that person.
They won't do it because why would they? Because the fixer's constantly rescuing them from pain and consequences. So that person, they're like, they're not going to put a boundary in place. Why? Because they're benefiting from that relationship. So the boundary has to come from the fixer, realizing I am not just causing harm to myself, but I'm crippling your ability to function as a healthy person. And I'm actually taking away from your opportunity to become a confident, functioning person. So again, there is times where it is like, I have to put in a boundary because you are no longer a safe person.
Yeah.
And that's one way. But I love this quote, like boundaries are the distance at which I can love both you and me simultaneously.
Ooh, say it again.
Yeah, boundaries create the distance, the healthy distance where I can love both you and me simultaneously.
Man.
You have to look at how does this boundary serve the relationship?
Yeah.
A good, healthy boundary serves. And a healthy person will respect your boundary.
Yeah.
A person who's been benefiting off of your lack of boundary will test and push and maybe make you feel guilty for it.
Yeah. Man, that's so good. So reframing boundaries as compassionate clarity. And so I love that quote, this idea that boundaries, they don't push people away. They invite connection and they invite clarity. Boundaries build trust. And I'd also say boundaries build self-trust, self-respect.
Yes, that's huge.
And if you've never initiated or put a boundary in place, we'll get to that at the end of our episode today, what we're talking about. But this compassionate clarity can be a chance for you to learn and develop some self-respect that is taught through implementing and establishing a boundary.
Mm-hmm.
Man, that's so good. I love that quote. Loving both of us simultaneously.
Yeah.
Man, that's good.
Yeah.
That's good. Okay, how about we jump to, this idea of like boundaries in real life?
Yeah.
Because it's super easy. Right now, this is great, man. Like,
yeah, it's
set
up
a
here.
boundary. It's about you. It's about me.
It's, we're in our cognitive head where it's logic. We don't have to feel it too much.
Yeah.
But now if we put it into real life, this is where I think our feelings come up. So, yeah. Do you want to unpack? Do you want to take one?
Yeah, I do. I think I'm just still sitting with that quote is compassionate clarity and the idea that the boundary is a place in which we can, in a healthy way, love both of us simultaneously.
I think I think this segues. I have a real life analogy, like or a situation.
Okay.
So let's say, for example, you live in the same city as family. Let's say, like, I remember a close friend of mine in high school. She lived on the same cul-de-sac. Like, her parents lived next door to her grandparents, and across the street was her aunt and uncle. So it was like the whole family lived on a cul-de-sac. And without boundaries, they could just walk in at any given time and, just walk in on life. Okay, so that's without a boundary, but like this idea of loving one another simultaneously. So imagine because there's not a boundary, a family member can show up without any notice and just walk in your house at any given time. Now, if you happen to be having a good morning, it might not be a problem.
Yeah.
But let's say if the dog just puked, the kids are fighting, your coffee has gone cold.
I was hoping you haven't mention something about coffee.
Yeah. Oh yeah. Your coffee has gone cold. Your hot
coffee
has gone cold. You haven't had your caffeine yet. You haven't had a moment to yourself. And then the in-law or the family member walks in. Okay. Here's how the lack of boundary now is going to cause harm to both parties. I am not going to be my best self. I am probably going to be short, snappy, rude. I'm not going to be fully present in the conversation. I'm probably going to be like, there is no part of me that's going to be pleasant. And I might actually hurt my family members' feelings because they've walked in like excited for a visit. And I'm like, you know what? I don't have time for this, yada, yada, yada. And so that person could potentially be hurt. But then once they leave, I now have lost respect for myself, or I'm upset with myself that I acted in that way, being like, oh my gosh, like I was rude, I wasn't kind. So now if I put a boundary in place, it's like, hey, all I ask for is like, call me 15 minutes just to make sure it's okay. That way I know there's an opportunity for me if it's a stressful morning. I don't want you to have to walk into my stress. Like you and I deserve to have like very present conversation. And I want to give you my best. And if I'm never given notice, I can't promise you my best. Now, maybe that's fine, but that's just an example of like how a boundary in that moment would have served both parties.
And that's good. That's good. Some other real life places. We'll talk through marriage, kids, work, and the last but not least, kind of what we were talking about is compassionate clarity. It also needs to be with yourself.
Mm-hmm.
And so with marriage, there's the idea of boundaries and we talked a little about this in the sense of control, and where, I end, you begin. In marriage, those boundaries can be a place of being clear with one another without being controlling.
Yeah. Can you speak to that a little bit? Because I know, I have like a very, just if our audience hasn't learned this about me yet, I have a very deep fear of being controlled, like losing autonomy. And mind you, I'm very thankful I don't experience that in our marriage at all. You're very good to me. But, I think there's
are some. But?
No. And I think there are people that fear like, what does it look like to be clear without controlling? How does that look in a safe, loving partnership?
Yeah. I think there's the one example that comes to my head, and this is a very mundane example, but sometimes loading the dishwasher.
Oh,
is
interesting.
where I'm going with this one.
Okay.
And the reason I use this one is it's a very non-threatening, low conflict scenario, but it can be a boundary in the sense of where, I end, you begin. I love Tetris and I love efficiency and I love loading the dishwasher in a very certain way to get every dish in there to run at once. Whereas
I feel like I'm the same way. Oh my gosh. Not to your standard. Oh my gosh. Ooh. It's about to be a high conflict, Scott. Gloves up.
But I guess what I'm talking about is, again, this is a low, mundane example, but that's a moment where I need to understand I am Enneagram 1 fixer. I am the one that I can have some perfectionist tendencies. And so if I see something not done the way I would do it, I could very easily jump in there and start reorganizing it and whatever. But there's a point in which I have to have my own personal boundary for what do I need to actually own? Is that for mine to own? Do I need to own loading the dishwasher perfectly every time? Or is there a boundary there in the sense of, there's a lot to say in this analogy, but like, is there a boundary in the sense of one, I don't need to own that. That's not something that I need to solve. Is that a high importance? No, it's not a high importance. And is another one is when we're driving and you might have thoughts on which way we need to go and what do I say?
Or the parking spot, the perfect parking spot that you just drove by and I don't understand. I'm like, that was the spot there. Oh, it's gone.
And so some of that boundaries like that I set with you is like, who's driving? Right?
That's what you say. You're like,
who's driving?
Who's driving?
Who's driving? We're going to get there. We're going to get there. And so I think the idea, and those are very mundane examples, but if you can blow those up into different scenarios, basically the driving piece is, do you need to control where we park? Right?
Yes, I do.
Do you need to control where we park? Or is this a boundary that doesn't need to be, that just doesn't need to be there?
I think just a little bit more when it's not parking or dishwasher. I think there have been moments where you being my spouse and knowing me, knowing areas that drain me, knowing areas where I have not put in a boundary for my sake. I know there have been times you have put in a boundary to protect me from emotional exhaustion, from me. You have seen, like, there have been times where sometimes I can get lost in trying to save someone from pain. That is where my specific adaptive personality type is a hustler, but my secondary would be the fixer.
Yeah.
Where I want to forget myself and just so badly want to rescue someone from their pain.
Yeah.
And you have seen it it gets so bad where I am unable to be present. I'm lost. I hyperfixate for hours,
Yeah.
days. I've left. And so I know in your love for me and trying to protect my mental and emotional health, there have been times where you have said, "Hey, I know this is really important to you, but I'm going to ask that you um don't spend so much time fixating on this. Like you have I've seen you want to talk to me about a boundary for me, being like, "Hey, don't get sucked up in this. Like watch how often you're texting them." Um and that's not you controlling. That's not you being like, "I don't like that I'm not getting attention from you." It's like I can see how this is robbing you of peace and joy and presence. And because you're so wrapped up in it, I want to invite you to maybe look at this and set a boundary.
Yeah. That reminds me of another boundary. And, I think sometimes, don't want to speak to this. Yeah. So I think sometimes in marriages, specifically from a man's point of view, I think sometimes we think we need to own everything in our household and we need to know all and everything. And so I do think a boundary that I've had to instill is knowing that you're still your own person,
Mm,
right? And that's healthy,
mm,
that there is a healthy connection with us. And part of that healthy connection is knowing that you are your own.
mm.
As much as we are one unit, as much as we grow together, you still have, your friends, you still have areas that you need to recharge. And a boundary for me is knowing that I not only shouldn't die for reasons of enmeshment and so forth, but it's also unhealthy for me to deeply know every intricate, every conversation, every place all those things.
Oh, so this would be like a boundary around like my friendships, my conversations I'm
Yeah.
having outside of our marriage, like, and that comes from a lot of love and trust and safety is just having that. I think one I asked you about that you said yesterday that you had to process early in our marriage when I first went to therapy was realizing that was a boundary. Like that was like my wife is going to process with a professional,
Yeah. And that's healthy.
and that's healthy.
And
Yeah.
there was yeah, I don't know if it's like story or unease or something that first popped up. And I grew up around therapy. And I think it's healthy and I think everyone should at
Yep.
one time.
Yay, therapy.
Could, should, not should. No shame language. But I remember processing it the first time and going like, how do I handle this? And mostly because part of this, I'm a fixer in a lot of ways. And
Mm,
so sometimes I want to know all the things so I can speak into them. But if you're in therapy, I have to trust that you're with a professional that has
mm,
our best interest, your best interest
mm,
in mind. And I don't need to know every intricate piece of what you're sharing,
yeah.
and have trust there. So
Yeah.
part of that boundary, I guess I spoke more to my own boundaries, interesting, than to maybe having to put a boundary between us in marriage. But that's that idea of controlling in marriage is that boundary can help create autonomy and keep autonomy between two people that allows them to stay in healthy connection.
Yeah, that's really good. Let's talk about boundaries and kiddos.
Yeah, we talked about that one for a long time.
But I think it's good. Yeah.
I think it is
Boundaries and
good.
kiddos.
Boundaries with kids. What do you think? They test them.
Oh, Lordy. They're the dog that sits there and drains the battery until we've got nothing left and then they blast through it.
Oh, man. So I think boundaries with kids, and I struggle with this a little bit, but this is the idea of modeling versus over explaining.
I laugh because you do tend to over explain, and our kids,
I want them to
watch them
get it.
check out. I watch them like their eyes glaze over. But I know what you're trying to communicate. I get it, but I know in their little brain, like it needs to be demonstrated more than it needs to be described.
Yeah. Yeah. So give me a boundary where that implements, where that happens, where it is modeled versus over communicated.
Oh gosh. I don't know. Do you have one in mind? I don't have one in mind. It's all like, it all feels like it to me.
Well, I think in this case, one that comes up a lot is repair and how we repair.
Oh,
so
yes.
For instance,
yeah.
What I mean by that is, especially if we're going to model repair, it's one thing to say like, hey, when you get in a fight or when you disagree, you need to say sorry and you need to go say, I accept your apology instead of just over explaining it and saying, and this is why that happens, and this is how it settles conflict, and this is instead what we have start to practice more in our home is modeling the repair and doing it, like actually doing it. And there's plenty of times where we've lost our cool and we've had to go seek repair and say, hey, daddy shouldn't have done that, right? The boundary of me losing my cool. I'm the adult. I'm the one that needs to seek regulation. I'm the one that needs to control my emotions. Our kids are just learning this.
Yeah.
We're expecting, I think sometimes some circles expect kids to have everything together and know how to respond in all situations. In reality, they're learning still.
Their brain's not fully developed until the age of 25. So
for us, part of that boundary is understanding, okay, the boundary is I need to not lose my cool. And if I do, or when I do, I need to model what it looks like to repair.
Yeah. Now that I think of it, a boundary we've put in place is like, this is, okay, you're allowed to be upset. You are allowed to be angry. But what you cannot do is you cannot hit.
Yeah.
You cannot bite, kick, whatever.
Slam
doors. We've kind of said like, if you do, then we will leave until you are ready to engage. Like, it's like
name calling,
those things. It's like, this is the boundary. Like, you're allowed to be angry, but what you will not do, what is not okay, what we will not tolerate is these behaviors. And if you do those behaviors, this is how we will respond.
Yeah.
And so that is
compassionate clarity.
Yeah. That is compassionate clarity ahead of time. And so, and we still have one that's like, I don't think you mean that. So let's test the boundary again today.
Of course. So I think there's a lot to say with kids there, but I think that's a really good one. The compassionate clarity, an expectation that's set before the moment. It's not and I struggle with this in the sense of like in the moment, I can be really reactive with like, well, and you're not getting this, or you're not getting this. And
I'm like, Scott, it's like 5 things.
Turns into our kid being in a bubble for the rest of their life. Not proud of it, outing myself. There you go. But part of that compassionate clarity is that this boundary is set prior to the heat of the moment, right? Or after after we're
when
regulated.
It's calm.
After it de-escalates.
Yeah.
How about when it comes to at work?
Yeah. I think this is huge is I think depending on the stress type, the boundaries look different in working environments. The fawn responsive people pleaser is going to take on more than what their scope, what's in their job description. They want to make sure that they're not displeasing their boss or their manager. They don't want to ruffle any feathers. They want to be the good employee to the point where they will work until burnout. They will work beyond their capacity. They will work beyond those things to the point of exhaustion and overwork. Whereas, our freeze might not ask for help. They might not outsource. They might spin and get stuck for hours on a task not moving forward. Our flight, they're going to be very busy, but they're going to be busy doing the wrong projects. Like they're not going to be moving the needle forward. And then our fighter, they're going to be like, again, they're going to be micromanaging.
Yeah,
they're not going to delegate.
Yeah.
They're not going to. So there's different ways to look at that. So you have to understand like, what is in my job? What is mine to own and what is not?
Yeah.
How do I advocate for myself to show up as a healthy, functional person in this workspace? What does clear, kind communication look like for the sake of staying, having self-respect even in the workplace? So again, understanding like, okay, huge one, like, I see that, hear that. Here's the projects I'm currently working on. I don't have the capacity for that at this point in time. Just reminding people, hey, here's my current project scope that I'm working on. Here's the projects at hand. Here's why I don't have bandwidth for that. We can revisit, or there's a lot of different ways to practice this.
I think we talk about, I don't know if we've talked about it on our podcast yet, but this idea of a zone of genius.
Oh yeah, that could be a whole other episode.
We talk about like a fight response, not delegating. You're definitely outside of your zone of genius.
Oh yeah.
And you're not allowing others to work within their zone of genius.
Oh, I see this with a fight type all the time. They end up doing $35 an hour tasks when their skill set is, $300 an hour tasks. And it's like, why are you dropping down into these $35 an hour tasks because you're micromanaging and now you're losing money. They don't see it that way.
Yeah. So real life example, last but not least, but I think is pivotal because everything else is built on this. And this is the idea of boundaries with yourself and this idea of honoring your energy and your own time commitments. And I think this is the zinger.
Huge.
This is the zinger right here for everything else between kids, marriage, work, compassionate clarity, resolving conflict, healthy relationships. Is this self piece is you can't set boundaries with others if you constantly violate your own. That is a zinger.
Can you say that one more time, Scott? Because that
zinger.
is for the people in the back.
You can't set boundaries, specifically compassionate boundaries, compassionate clarity, clear compassionate boundaries. You can't set boundaries with others if you consistently violate your own.
We'll let that one sit for a second.
Yeah. I just, if that's where we have our Happy Well homework that's coming.
Yeah.
Just after this. But if you can pause with that statement, with that thought that you can't set boundaries with others if you consistently violate your own, if you sit with that for a moment, maybe that's why boundaries have been so difficult for you. Maybe it has nothing to do with others and has everything to do with yours.
Yeah, I think this idea, it's like constantly violating your own boundaries is when you're constantly taking on more than you have capacity for.
Yeah.
Relationally, emotionally, work-wise, it's like it's not honoring your bandwidth, your capacity, and it's ignoring all of the slow down signs and just still moving forward with it. I actually think lack of boundaries or violated self-boundaries is a recipe for burnout.
Well, $1,000,000%.
On every level.
Yeah.
Emotionally, relationally, physically. It's one of at our Breakthrough Live event, it was someone that had a fawn response that was a caretaker. Because they didn't understand where they began and others end, where they ended and others began, they were constantly over-functioning to the point where they were neglecting their own health.
Right.
And they were physically unwell. Their health was actually becoming a chronic problem. And so, again, this is like violating, not acknowledging your capacity, your bandwidth, and your health. And because of that, her health was suffering. And so we have to kind of be able to look at, how am I taking on more than what I am capable of or, have the bandwidth for right now. My favorite saying is right now is, I don't have the bandwidth for that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Not at this time.
Well, part of that, Happy Well podcast, we talk about these metrics that the Grant study from Harvard that studied human happiness put in place. And it found these core pillars. And one of them, two that I'll highlight, but one of them specifically is about relationships and healthy relationships. And the other part of that is without, having conflict without excessive rumination. And I think part of boundaries is understanding, how do we have healthy relationships with people? How do we live in community in a healthy way? And when conflict arises, how do we do that without excessive rumination? And I think those two things about conflict, which we talked about last week, and about today with setting healthy boundaries and seeing them not as cruelty, but seeing them as with compassionate clarity, bringing relationships together in a healthy way. That's one of the ways that we build a happy, well life, is by having healthy relationships and being in community. And boundaries are going to be a part of creating those healthy relationships. I'm
going to say this too. Last thought on this, on boundaries, is like, you can have ongoing evaluation of your boundaries. Boundaries are not fixed or permanent. They can evolve based on your season and your capacity. So there might be a season where you have to be more boundaried, so to speak, or more strict with boundaries because of your current capacity. Knowing like, okay, I am caring for a sick parent, or we're moving, or huge job change. Okay, I'm going to have to put in more boundaries to protect my emotional health and bandwidth until this season passes. And then I will reevaluate Like, does this boundary still serve or can it be moved?
Yeah.
Not because I've been bullied or because I feel guilty or because I have a story about it. It's like, let's look at the season. Let's look at the bandwidth. Does this boundary still make sense at this certain place? So boundaries don't have to be fixed. They can evolve.
Yeah, that's so good. Okay, so the end of our podcast, we always do happy well homework because
do.
Oh, I forgot about that.
We got to do our jingle.
A little jingle. But the reason we do happy well homework is because we really believe that we're not just here to consume, and have information constipation, right? We're here to implement. And so today's happy well homework focuses on boundaries, as you might expect. But I'm going to add one thought to it. So first, that idea of like setting boundaries with others is impossible if you consistently violate your own. I think the first happy well homework, usually it's not 2 parts, but the first part of our happy well homework is to have an evaluation on your own boundaries with yourself. Areas in which that you maybe compromise, areas in which that maybe you move the goalpost because you feel guilty or whatever it might be. So first, have an evaluation on yourself and the boundaries that you currently are maybe not upholding.
Yeah, you can even say like, where am I abandoning myself to maintain the peace? And I'm going to call it's a false peace, but where am I dishonoring or negotiating with my health, my values, and what matters to me in order to maintain the peace or keep others happy?
Yeah. And then the other part of the happy well homework is to identify one relationship or area. Identify one relationship or area where you have felt maybe stretched thin, and write one. Now this is key. One kind, compassionate, clear boundary. Write that one clear, compassionate, kind boundary. Write that statement and then practice it.
I think what would help with that is asking, maybe in that ask, how does this boundary serve me? How does this help keep me functioning and whole? And how does this, almost asking like, how does this boundary help me love myself and love the other person simultaneously?
Yes. I was hoping you're going to bring that statement back.
Yes, because boundaries are the distance at which I can love myself and love you simultaneously. So when you're writing down the boundary, ask, how am I loving myself and loving them simultaneously with this boundary?
So good. Hey, that's today's podcast. We hope you really enjoyed it. Again, if you're watching on YouTube, we'd love for you to put a comment down below. Interact with this. Write some thoughts, maybe some boundaries, some struggles, a boundary that maybe you were scared to implement, but man, really served you when you tried it. If you're listening on a streaming device, write a review. Really helps people find the podcast. And we hope that you'll come with us next week as we dive into more Happy Well concepts on the Pursuit of Happy Well podcast.
We'll see you next time.
See you next time.